I would like to welcome our speaker for the day, Maddie. Let's give Maddie a warm welcome.
Thanks, Allison. Hey, everybody. How are you? Good. It's been a minute since I've been up here. It's good to see you all, but you're going to be seeing a lot of me in the next month. So it's been a while, but I'll be preaching a couple more times soon. So good to see you all again. As Allison mentioned, my name is Maddie. I'm the ministry assistant here at the River. And today I want to talk about what it means to be in community when the world feels like it's always in a state of crisis. I think we might know how that feels looking at the news recently. Over the past few weeks, Pastor Allison preached a series called How We Church Matters. And each sermon explored a different facet of how our communal life reflects what we believe about God. So a couple weeks ago, she preached about the importance of embracing freedom as a core value in our life together. She reminded us that the way that we organize ourselves, how we lead, how we participate, is a reflection of our theological commitments and our commitments to each other. If we say we believe in a God who sets people free, then our life together, how we do church together, how we do community together, should reflect that. So what does freedom-based community look like? Freedom-based community looks like people choosing to show up because they want to, not because they've been guilted into it. It looks like generosity that flows from gratitude rather than pressure. It looks like leadership that trusts people's agency instead of trying to control every single outcome. And it looks like saying yes out of joy rather than obligation. And that's actually a lot harder than it sounds. I know that as I say those things, I'm thinking of all types of communities that I've been part of where maybe not all of those things have been true. And you can probably think of some as well, whether it's been another church environment, whether it's been work, whether it's been a family system that you've been part of. It's a lot harder than it sounds, and that's because freedom requires trust. It means giving up the illusion of control, the illusion that if we just plan carefully enough, or push hard enough, or remind people often enough, we can guarantee the results that we want. And that's really hard because oftentimes when we start to lose that sense of control, when things feel uncertain, when outcomes slip out of our hands, when we start to reach for things that feel like control. So when things start not going our way, we start to reach for things that feel like control. What do I mean by that? When we're in situations that feel out of our control, when we're failing at something, when a person in our lives isn't responding to us in the way that we would like, when something isn't going our way, the temptation is to dig in, to double down, and to resort to coercive tactics to try to force things to get better. And one of the most common coercive tactics that people or organizations use to try to force things to get better is by applying urgent pressure. We use urgency to try to make things go our way. So what's an example of that? It's that moment when a coworker says, if you don't help me with this right now, everything's gonna fall apart. Maybe you've had a coworker, maybe you've had a family member do that to you who tends to use urgency tactics. And suddenly you feel like the whole project or the whole relationship depends on saying yes. Sometimes as parents, we might do that to kids. We say, you have to do this or you'll ruin your future if you don't, and you need to do it now. And in all of these cases, there's a mix of love and of fear tangled together. We want things to work out. We want people to care. So we lean on urgency to get results. And there's something to be said for that. We want the results because the results are good. But what we're really doing without meaning to is we're using anxiety to motivate instead of trust. It's when we let pressure replace trust. It's when our caring turns into grasping. And it's one of the easiest ways that communities, especially communities that care, slip out of freedom and back into control. Because when urgency becomes our default way of functioning, when it becomes the only tone that we know, it starts to shape us. It teaches us to rely on pressure instead of trust. It teaches us that the only way to motivate people is to scare them just a little. And before we know it, we've built relationships with workplaces, with churches, with communities, with families that depend on anxiety in order to function. So what does this have to do with the Bible? Today, we're going to explore what the Bible has to offer us as we work to quell this impulse that we all have to manage through pressure, to lead through urgency, and to love through control. So we're going to talk about what it looks like to be a community that operates outside of crisis mode, even as we navigate a world together that feels like it is in a constant state of crisis. Because if we're being honest, it makes sense that we end up living in this way. It makes sense that urgency becomes our default setting because the world actually does feel like it's in crisis, and there are many very real crises that are happening right now in our personal lives and just in the world in general. Every headline feels like a breaking headline, and we live in a time just in general when everything feels high stakes, high speed, high pressure, all of the time. And most of us have learned to survive by matching the pace of the world. And that's exhausting. So we keep responding to the exhaustion by doing the one thing we know how to do, which is tightening our grip. When the world feels like it's spiraling, urgency feels like safety. It gives us the illusion that we are in control. And I think this is such an important question for us to wrestle with, not just as individuals, but also as a church. What does it mean to be a community that operates outside of crisis mode? How can we sustain ourselves communally without falling back on the same urgency tactics that many folks here have experienced in churches that they grew up in? And you may be familiar with this type of church culture where everything is always an emergency, where every announcement feels like a plea. We're desperate for volunteers. We're running out of money. If people don't step up, this ministry might not survive. And if you've ever been part of a church like that, you know how exhausting it can be. It can start to feel like love is measured by how quickly you respond to a crisis, or like the only way to stay faithful is to always be busy, or like your worth in the community depends on how much you can give before you burn out. So today I want to explore some biblical alternatives to that. And there are a number of places in the Bible that we could look to for wisdom on this, but the one passage that I'd like to start with today is the story of the Israelites in Exodus 16. So this story takes place right after the Israelites have been freed from slavery in Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea, they've witnessed miracles, but now they're in the wilderness and they're hungry. So here's how the story begins. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." So they've just been liberated, but they're already looking back. They're saying, at least in Egypt, we had food. Because freedom can feel terrifying when you've lived your whole life under control. And so it's this moment that maybe you've experienced in your life where you suddenly have freedom, and that's nice, but there's a part of you that's like, well, this system of control was at least providing for me. And in a system of freedom, do I have that still? And so God responds not by scolding them, not by saying you should be more grateful, but by giving them exactly what they need. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day." Enough for just that day. Not for the week, not for the month, just enough for today. And then God adds a condition: let no one leave any of it over until morning. But of course, some people do. They did not listen to Moses. Some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. So the extra manna that they were trying to save up to try to keep beyond one day, that extra manna spoiled. So what does this mean? This is a challenging story. And it's challenging on a personal level because it pushes right up against our instincts. Most of us have been taught that the responsible thing to do is to plan ahead, to save for the future, to make sure there's always a little extra just in case. And that's not a wrong instinct to have, right? Planning, saving, preparing, these are all good things. They're ways of participating in God's care for ourselves and for others. Scripture is full of a lot of wisdom about stewardship and about foresight. But what's challenging about this story is that God is saying right here, only gather enough for today. No margin, no backup plan, no safety net. And that feels risky. It even feels a little bit reckless. Because if you've ever lived through instability, whether it's financial, emotional, relational, you know that just enough for today doesn't always feel like enough. Everything in us wants to protect against that kind of uncertainty. Living for just today, there's something that feels really unstable about that. So how do we reconcile that? How do we reconcile what this story is doing with things that we hear elsewhere in the Bible that are encouraging us to be responsible stewards who plan and who save, and with our own experience of instability as well? This story is challenging because it's been used and misused in ways that have hurt people. People in power have sometimes pointed to this passage to tell others to stop asking for more, to be content with less, to accept their circumstances as God's will. It's been used to shame people for wanting security. It's been used to say that faith means never planning, never saving, never protesting your conditions. But to me, that's not what this story is about. I don't think that this story is about keeping people small. It's not about sanctifying scarcity or telling people who are in need to just trust God more. Planning and saving and stewardship are all valuable. The problem is often that it can be hard to believe that we ever have enough or are doing enough, and that can trap us. So I think what this story is really doing, I think it's a story about God dismantling the mindset of slavery that these folks had just come out of. And what is that mindset of slavery? It's the belief that your worth depends on what you can produce, or that your survival depends on someone else's control. It's a story about learning to live without fear as the thing that organizes you. And that's why I still love this story, even with its challenges. So to give some context, the Israelites had just been set free from slavery in Egypt, but the freedom is disorienting. They're used to living under Pharaoh's system, a system of endless production, constant work, constant fear that if they stop, that they will be punished. So they leave Egypt, but Egypt doesn't leave them overnight. They carry that urgency, that fear, that scarcity mindset with them into the desert. And when they run out of food, the first thing they do is panic. They say to Moses, at least back in Egypt, we had bread. We might have been slaves, but at least we didn't starve. And God answers that panic with daily bread. Manna that appears every morning, just enough for that day. Not for the week, not for the month, just for today. And God tells them, don't gather extra. Don't hoard. Don't try to secure tomorrow today. And of course, some people try anyway. They store it up just to be safe, and it rots overnight. Because what God is doing in that story isn't just feeding their bodies. God is actually retraining how they interact with the world. He's retraining their relationship with each other and their relationship with God. God is teaching them what freedom feels like. And freedom, it turns out, feels like just enough for today. Think about how strange that must have felt for them. Their whole lives, they lived by a system that said, work harder, produce more, plan further ahead. Now God is saying you can rest, you can trust, you can wake up and find what you need waiting for you. No urgency, no hoarding, no crisis management, just enough for today. That's not how Pharaoh runs a society, but it's how God does. And I think most of us know what it's like to live in Pharaoh's world. Even if we've never built bricks, we've learned how to keep pushing past our limits. We've been trained to believe that being busy means being responsible, or that exhaustion means that we care, or that urgency equals importance. I know when I was working in corporate America, that was just normal. Everything was urgent. Every email said ASAP. Every meeting was a fire drill. Partly because of the organizations I was working for, and some of you might have had that experience too. I remember one quarter when our team was behind on our goals and everyone was on edge. We were working late, we were skipping breaks, we were glued to our inboxes. I told myself, if I work just a little harder, if I can get my team to push just a little harder, we'll make it. And we did hit goal, but I remember sitting at my desk the next morning and feeling completely wiped out because at that point, nothing had really changed, right? There was just a new goal and a new deadline and a new urgent problem to solve. And that was when I started to reflect and to notice that this way of living, this constant urgency, never actually leads to the peace or the results that we use to justify it. It gets some results, right? There's some immediate result that you're getting. Sometimes you need those results, but it doesn't actually build trust. It's exhausting and it doesn't stop on its own. You can spend your whole life trying to get ahead of the next crisis, but the next crisis always comes. And beyond that, it led me to treat people in ways that I'm not proud of. The urgency that was being directed at me, I ended up passing on to others. I became the person making everything an emergency and being resentful when other people didn't step up in the way that I needed them to. And that made me someone who people didn't really want to be around. It made my relationship shallow and transactional. It made it so that people respected me for what I could do, but that was really as far as it went. I wasn't connecting with people on a deeper level. And that's what makes the Manna story feel so different and comforting to me, because it rejects that entire logic. It's about God teaching people to live differently, to trust that there will be enough for today. Not everything, not security forever, but enough. That is what I was missing in that season of my life. I was trying to make my own safety by controlling everything I could. But the thing about control is that it never actually delivers what it promises. It keeps you busy, but not actually secure. What God offers the Israelites in Exodus is something else entirely, a pattern of steady provision. It's slower, and it's smaller, and it's less dramatic than the way that Pharaoh runs things, but it is sustainable. And that's what got the Israelites through 40 years in the desert. It worked. But of course, it didn't end there. Thousands of years later, after Jesus died and rose and ascended into heaven, the early church was trying to figure out what was going to work for them. It was a challenging time. There were new Christian communities popping up across the Roman world. These were little pockets of believers in cities like Philippi, Thessalonica, Ephesus, and Corinth. And each one of these little communities in the early church was trying to live out a radically different kind of social vision in the midst of an empire built on competition, hierarchy, and control. So they were surrounded by systems that measured worth in terms of productivity, wealth, and power. So in many ways, these early Christians, these early church communities, they were facing the same question the Israelites were facing in the wilderness, but in a different form. How do you live by the economy of God's grace when everything around you runs on the economy of fear? One of these Christian communities was situated in Corinth, which is located in modern-day Greece. And the Apostle Paul both visited this community and also wrote them multiple letters that are now part of the New Testament. So in his second letter to the Corinthians, he's writing to them again, this time to encourage them to give money to another community, the struggling church in Jerusalem. He writes, "I do not mean that there should be relief for others and pressure on you, but it is a question of fair balance between your present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may be for your need, in order that there may be a fair balance." What is he saying here? What is this? So he's saying, hey, church in Corinth, you guys have money. This church in Jerusalem does not. So you should really give to them. And at first glance, that sounds like he's asking for a simple offering from one church to another, but there's actually a lot more going on underneath that. The church in Jerusalem was made up of mostly Jewish believers, the first followers of Jesus, people who still practiced the traditions of Israel and who carried the memory of God's covenant with their ancestors. So that's the church of Jerusalem. The Corinthians, on the other hand, were mostly Gentiles. These were Greek and Roman converts who didn't share that background, who were new to this story, and who often struggled to understand how they fit into it. So when Paul invites the Corinthians to give, this isn't just an ordinary ask for money. He's asking these Gentiles to cross a pretty tense divide. Because at that time, there was still a real tension between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians over whose customs mattered, whose way of worshiping was right, who really belonged in the Christian movement. But in spite of that, he's telling the Corinthians that it's actually quite important that they come together with the Church of Jerusalem and support them in a material way. Why is that so important in this context? Because what Paul is doing here isn't just organizing a fundraiser, he's actually resisting the logic of the empire. The Roman world that Paul was part of ran on hierarchy and competition. It was a system where your value was determined by what you owned, who you knew, and how much honor you could display. And everywhere you looked, there was a pecking order. It was men over women, masters over slaves, citizens over foreigners, rich over poor. And the whole system was built to keep people climbing or clawing to stay ahead. It was an economy of scarcity that had the trappings of abundance. There were plenty of resources, but they were hoarded at the top, and people were told to believe that there was never enough to go around. So when Paul writes to these little Christian communities scattered across the empire and says, share with one another, care for one another, give freely to one another, he's not just talking about being kind or making a donation. He's actually offering them a whole different way of being in community with one another. He's saying in the body of Christ, we don't compete for worth. We don't hoard for security. Here we practice interdependence, the kind of mutual care that the empire calls foolish. We believe that what we have was never just ours to begin with. Solidarity between communities, between Jews and Gentiles, wasn't just a nice idea. It was a form of resistance. It was a way of saying to Rome, we refuse to play your game or to operate on your terms. You tell us that only the strong survive. We're going to build a community where the strong carry the weak. You tell us that generosity is risky. We're going to believe that grace multiplies when it's shared. So Paul writes that the point is this: the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the one who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each of you must give as you have made up your mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to provide you with every blessing in abundance, so that by always having enough, you may share abundantly in every good work. That's Paul's theology of enough. He's saying God's abundance doesn't work like the empire's abundance. In Rome, the more you give away, the less you have. But in God's economy, the more you share, the more there is to go around. And notice the tone here too. He doesn't pressure them. He doesn't threaten them. He doesn't say, if you don't give, this ministry will collapse. He trusts that people really understand God's grace. If they really believe in God's steady provision, generosity will flow naturally. Paul is describing a way of life that's the opposite of crisis mode. He's describing a community that gives freely because it trusts freely, a community that doesn't need to be motivated by guilt or fear or panic because it believes that love rather than anxiety is what keeps it alive. And I want to pause for a second to name that this idea of God's provision, that God will just provide, can feel complicated. Because most of us know what it's like to pray for something, whether it's security or healing or relief, and to not see it come right away or to not see it come at all. Trusting that God will provide doesn't mean expecting everything to work out easily. It doesn't mean that faith guarantees comfort or success. That's not what we're talking about here. This isn't a prosperity gospel. It's something quieter and more resilient than that. It's the trust that even when we can't see where the manna will come from next, we are still held in a story of care. Sometimes provision looks like miracles. Other times it looks like people showing up for one another. But in both cases, God is there. So what does that mean for us, for the way that we move through our days? I think it means that we have to start paying attention to how urgency captures us. Most of us wake up and we're already behind. Before our feet hit the floor, we're scrolling headlines, messages, notifications that tell us what is on fire today. We open our inbox and it's a list of things that were due yesterday. And when you wake up to that day after day after day, over time that starts to do something to us. We start treating our attention like it's a scarce resource, rationing it, fragmenting it, letting it be pulled in 100 different directions. And that impacts how we show up with people who we care about. Our interactions start to become shorter, more transactional, more pointed. We start to pass on some of that stress and pressure that we're feeling. We start to operate in crisis mode, defaulting to urgency tactics to get what we need from people. What would it look like if in the midst of that daily feeling of crisis, we somehow found a way to step back, to connect with God, and to try as best we can to operate from a place of abundance? What would it look like if we found a way to connect on a deeper level with the people around us and resist all of the incentives that we might have in any given moment to treat them transactionally? What if we resisted the urge to compete and to stratify and to hoard, and instead found little ways to practice interdependence, to give cheerfully from the abundant life that we've been given in God? We do live in a moment where everything feels like a crisis, and that is real. I'm not going to erase that. There is a lot of material harm that is going on in the world right now, and there is a lot of reason to worry. But if we're going to rise to meet this moment together, we can't be living in crisis mode. If there's anything that the Israelites taught us and that the early church taught us, it's that you can't build a community of trust on a foundation of panic. You can't sustain love on adrenaline. You can't cultivate joy when everyone is running on fear. The Israelites had to learn that in the wilderness. The early church had to learn that under empire. And we have to learn it here, in our own wilderness, under our own empires of productivity and pressure, how to be a people who live differently. So what might it look like for us here at the river to live that way? It means that we're not going to send emails with the subject line, urgent, donate now so the church can survive. Even though there's a reality that we do need your donations for the church to survive. There's that tension. And we do kind of need to know now what people are able to give so that we can plan and have a budget. That's just a reality of running an organization. But we've decided as an organization that we're going to embody freedom and healthy interdependence. We're going to do this sustainably. We're not going to operate in crisis mode. We're going to trust that we're going to figure this out together between us and God day by day. And we're going to pray that we can come together and all give from a place of God's abundance so that we can continue to operate as a community with a space and with a staff and with programming. And my hope is that this church can be a space for you away from the logics of the world that tell you that your worth depends on your output, your productivity, or your ability to keep up. I hope that this can be a place that helps you to remember that you are not what you produce. You are not the next deadline. You are not the next crisis. You are beloved. And there will be enough for today. And if there isn't, you're part of a community that will be with you through today and will try to help you get what you need. But that kind of community, the kind that actually helps us live differently, doesn't happen by accident. It takes practice. It takes daily habits that retrain us out of urgency and back into trust. So I want to leave you with a few small ways you might practice this in your week ahead, simple, concrete things that can begin to loosen the hold that crisis has on your body, your mind, and your spirit. Maybe it looks like this. First, practice a daily pause. Before you open your phone in the morning, before the flood of headlines and notifications rushes in, take 30 seconds to breathe and pray, God, give me enough just for today. That's it. Let that prayer reset your pace before the world sets in for you. 2, pick one thing and do it slower on purpose. Walk a block slower than usual, eat a meal without multitasking, fold the laundry, wash the dishes without background noise, and let that slowness itself become a kind of prayer, a way of reminding yourself that you are not behind, that time is not your enemy, and that God is not rushing you. And then 3, make time to notice God's provision. At the end of the day, write down one place where you saw manna, one way God showed up with enough. It could be a meal with a friend, a text you needed to hear, a quiet moment that steadied you. Naming it helps you remember that abundance is real, and it's there. And then because spiritual practice and community are never separate, there's one way we can practice this together here at the river. Over the next few weeks, as we plan for the year ahead, we're asking everyone who calls this place home to consider what it looks like to give. Not out of guilt or panic, not because the church will collapse if you don't, but because that's what it means to trust one another, to live as a people who believe God will keep showing up with daily bread. Allison spoke just now during our announcements about this, but last week at our community meeting, Allison rolled out our community census. This survey is an opportunity for you to reflect on what role the river plays in your life and to let us know what you plan to give in the next year. Whatever that looks like for you, we ask that you do it from a place of freedom, from a place of joy. Do it from a place of believing that this community matters and that God will provide what we need through us. That's my invitation to you today, to live not as people scrambling for control, but as people who trust that grace will be enough for today. To be a church that doesn't run on panic or guilt, but on peace. A church that moves at the pace of manna, slow enough to notice, faithful enough to share. So this week, as you go back into a world that will tell you that every hour is urgent, remember, you don't have to match its pace. You belong to a different story, one where love doesn't rush and grace is new every morning. With that, I would like to transition us to a time of communion and prayerful reflection. Here at the River, we practice open communion. Everyone is welcome to partake in the elements with us. You don't have to be a member of this or any church. And if you're joining us on the live stream, feel free to use whatever you have with you and to join in with us. You'll see some of our host team members coming around now with trays that have little things of juice. This is not wine. We are sober friendly here. And if you open the top of the juice, that's where you'll find the little wafer. Feel free to partake of the elements with us. We also have members of our prayer team who are going to be standing at the back. So if you're looking for prayer, feel free to head back there as we move into a time of response together. Friends, communion at its heart is a story of enough. It's the story of a God who feeds us, not with abundance that overwhelms, but with sustenance that sustains. Just enough bread, just enough grace for today. When Jesus gathered his friends around a table on the night before his death, it wasn't a feast of power or display. It was a simple meal shared among people who didn't fully understand what was happening, who were scared, who were about to scatter. And yet Jesus looked at them, their confusion, their fear, and said, "This is my body given for you. This is my blood poured out for you." In other words, even in your fear, there will be enough. even in the uncertainty of what's coming next, I will meet you here. So as we take this bread and this cup together, we remember that promise that even when the world feels like it's in crisis, even when we feel like we're barely holding it together, God meets us at the table, not demanding, not rushing, but offering us what we need for today. This table is a protest against the world's pace. It's a moment to slow down, to receive, and to trust that grace will come again tomorrow, just as it has today. So when you eat this bread and drink this cup, let it be a reminder you are part of a community sustained not by urgency, but by love. You are enough, there is enough, and God is already here. Amen.